In this video, I'm going to discuss attributes within the File Output and Frame Range section of the Render Settings window, and these are in the Common tab. Let's go to the most important attributes. At the very top of the File Output is the file name prefix. This will be the name assigned to your rendered still images or your rendered movie. You can enter any name you want to, pretty much. So for example, I can enter the word test here. Below that is image format. I've talked about some of the image formats before, but I'll go over this again fairly quickly. Now, most of the image formats you can choose will render out still images. In other words, for example, if I choose to render out a targa, what will happen is if I render out an entire animation that's, say, 100 frames long, I'll wind up with 100 individual targa images on the disk. So almost all of these render out a series of still images. Now, there's one that's a self-contained movie. If I pick AVI, then I'll have the entire animation, all 100 frames, rendered out into a single movie file. Or if you're using a Macintosh, you get the option to choose QuickTime. You get a single QuickTime movie file. Now, movie files are great for tests. If I wanted to make a test animation, I can render out an AVI file. However, they're not really good for anything professional. One disadvantage of AVI files or QuickTimes is, by default, they're compressed. Or in order to get a small file size, you have to use compression. That'll lessen your quality. Another problem is, if you choose to stop the batch render, the movie becomes broken and not useful. Let's say I have a 100 frame animation and I decide to stop at frame 50. There's a way to cancel batch render. Well, by canceling that movie is no good at all. However, if I choose to render a series of still images like targa, then when I cancel the batch render, everything up to that point is still good. So I can render out frame 1 to 50 and then cancel the render. But frame 1 to 50 or frame 1 to 49 are still perfectly good. They're good on the disk. And I can choose to relaunch the render and render out frame 50 to 100. Another advantage is the still image sequences like targa is you don't have compression. And that way you're guaranteed maximum quality. So if you go to work at a studio and work professionally, almost all the time you're going to render out a series of still images. You get the best quality, and then you can, if you need to, interrupt your batch render and restart it. But if you want to do a quick test, then maybe AVI is okay for a quick test. So aside from AVI and QuickTime, though, in terms of still images, there's a lot of options. I'll talk about a few of the common ones here, or at least ones that would be used professionally. Again, targa is a great format. It doesn't suffer from any loss of quality. It's not really compressed, so it's a good choice. It's used quite often. It does make for large file sizes, but you get really high quality. Below that is TIFF. TIFF is another format that's commonly used, makes great quality. Now, there is compression on TIFF by default, but it's used widely in the industry. Another one, if I go higher up, is Maya IFF. Maya IFF is a native format for Maya. It's a little bit more esoteric. If you want to use it externally, like for instance, if you wanted to render out a Maya IFF and open it in Photoshop, Photoshop cannot read it. So not as many external programs can understand it. However, a lot of studios will use it, and it's a very flexible format. Now, one advantage of Maya IFF, or TIFF, or targa is the fact that those formats can support alpha channels. And again, alpha channels are the fourth channel that stores information on transparency. So any empty space in Maya is interpreted as transparent, and you get that fourth channel to basically memorize that. Why would you want to do that? Well, if you bring these rendered images into a compositing program, which happens quite a bit in any kind of animation work, in order for the compositing program to know what's transparent, it has to use that alpha channel. So let's say I want to render out an animation and take it into Adobe After Effects. Well, I can render out a targa or a TIFF sequence or a Maya IFF sequence, and there I'm sure that the alpha channel would survive and would be interpreted correctly. Now, some of these image formats do not have alpha. And in fact, if you were to render out an AVI or QuickTime, no alpha channel. Or, for example, if we were to render out a JPEG sequence, no alpha. JPEG okay for a quick test. Again, AVI okay for a quick test, but no alpha information. You cannot use that appropriately in a compositing program. So targa and TIFF are a really good choice. Now, there are a bunch of other more esoteric image formats here, and you might find that occasionally you have reason to use them. But if you stick with the three I just mentioned, targa, TIFF, or Maya IFF, you're pretty safe. So in that case, you pick the format you want to render in, for instance, targa. Below that is frame animation extension. Now, this is important if you're rendering out more than one frame. Now, by default, it's set to a single frame. In fact, it says single frame. It says name.extension single frame. If you render out a single frame for print or a single frame as a test, that's okay. And that's really named that way. In fact, you can see what's going on with the naming if you go up here to the top. It'll show you what the resulting name is. In this case, it says file name here, test.tga for Targa. That's the name of the file you're going to get. Now, that doesn't work for animation sequence. If you want to render out more than one frame, you have to switch over to another extension. The most common one is the second choice. Most compositing programs and external programs will understand that. And that's name.number.extension. If I switch over to that, name.number.extension, you'll see the result up here. You'll see test.1.tga all the way up to test.10.tga. Now, since I'm rendering out more than one frame, that makes the frame range section available. So let's say I want to render out 100 frames. My start frame is 1 and my end frame is 100. And this is your naming convention you'll get. You'll get test.1.tga for your first frame and test.100.tga for your last frame. Now, once you start to get multiple frames, you have to be aware of how it's actually naming them so that other programs can read them correctly. In fact, let me show you how this works by bringing up Notepad. This is just Windows Notepad. And just for example, I want to type out how this works. So right now, it's going to give me this result, test.1.tga. Frame 10 would be named test.10.tga, and frame 100 would be named test.100.tga. Now, this is actually a potential problem because a program like After Effects will not understand how to order these correctly when it brings that series of still images in to work with them. So associated with this naming of multiple frames, there's a really important attribute you have to take a look at. That's frame padding, which is right here. Frame padding determines how many positions are left for the number. Right now that's set to 1, that's the default. That means there's no additional positions. However, if you change this to a higher number like 3, we'll see what happens. You'll see that right away right here. When you set to 3, all of a sudden it goes test.001.tga and test.100.tga. Why would you want that to happen? If I go back to Notepad, I can type that out. What that means is I'll always have 3 positions for my number. Always 3 positions. For 1, I get 001. For 10, I get 010. For 100, I get 100. All 3 positions there. That means that any number between 1 and 9 gets 00 in the number, 001, 002, 003, etc. Any frame between 10 and 99 will go 010, 011, 098, 099. And of course, 100 has 3 positions. And this is actually good from 100 to 999. By setting frame padding to 3, again, you get 3 positions for your number. And that guarantees that the number in between the 2 dots is the same length, same number of positions. In fact, you can see the names of each frame here have the same length across the page. In any case, by having the numeric placeholders have the same number of digits or same number of placeholders, your program like After Effects will know how to read them in the correct order. Now, if I was to go back and change frame padding to 2, this is what would happen. A frame padding to 2 means I only get 2 positions unless I get to a number that's bigger than 2 positions. So a padding of 2 will give me 01, 02, or 10, or 11, or 12, or 100, or 101. But in this case, because I have an equal number of placeholders, a program like After Effects might have difficulty reading these in the correct order. Now, you can be safe. What you can do is simply set frame padding to a big number, like 5, and always have 5 placeholders, and then no matter what you render, you'll be sure that the programs will read them in the correct order. You have a lot of extra zeros, but it doesn't really affect anything. The important thing is, though, to change the frame padding to make sure it makes sense. And in fact, you can just be safe by entering a big frame padding number. You're guaranteed that the placeholders will be logical. The thing not to do is not to leave it at 1 by default, because if you're rendering out like 100 frames, you'll see the uneven placeholders and other programs might be confused. So at least go ahead and set this to a higher number that makes sense, or set it to a really high number like 5, and then you're safe. Again, once you change the extension to name.number.extension, then you'll get your frame range. You just need to make sure you set your frame range to the range you want to actually render out. And that's up to you what you render out. It could be 1 to 25, 1 to 50, 1 to 100, whatever makes sense. Or it can even be frame 25 to frame 50, whatever you want. Now, the third attribute down here is by frame. You can actually skip frames if you want to in your render, but most of the time you want to render out by a single frame. In other words, you want to render out frame 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. But if you want to skip for some reason, you can enter 2, for example, and then you render out frame 1, then frame 3, then frame 5, then frame 7. But again, most of the time 1 makes sense. So those are the critical attributes within the file output and frame range section.